wanted to begin this program, appropriate for the season, with some artwork. Jolie Whitney put her creativity, her sharp wit, and a sharper knife to work to carve this pumpkin with our logo. Thank you, Jolie. And thank you for stopping by Across the Fence. I'm Keith Silva. When it comes to Halloween, do you think of carving pumpkins, vampires, ghosts, candy? How about the Spanish Inquisition, a homicidal monkey, or a raven? Nevermore indeed. The Great Illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe by Tony Magistrale and Jess Slayton was hailed by no less of an august organization than the Edgar Allan Poe Review, which wrote, "This book offers a close, detailed, and nuanced analysis of 5 periods of art inspired by the Gothic, grotesque, morbid, and macabre, poetry and prose of Poe." Joining us via Zoom to talk about Poe, illustration, and the Spanish Inquisition, perhaps, is Jess Slayton. She received her graduate degree in English from UVM in 2018, and she's now the director of a health tech company in New York City and a freelance writer. Jess, welcome to Across the Fence.
Thanks so much for having me.
And joining me in the studio is someone who has been haunting our set this time of year for the last decade or so, UVM professor and former chair of the UVM English department, and a man who has stood eye to eye with the Raven himself, or at least his statue located in Edgar Allan Poe Square in Boston, Tony Magistrale. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Keith. It's good to be back.
Always good to have you here. Jess, this book grew out of your graduate work in both art history and English. How did it come about? How did you come up with this idea?
Yeah, for sure. So I studied my whole undergraduate career. I was, part English, part art history, right? And so that was always my interest. And when I entered graduate school, I was lucky enough that Tony was teaching one of the couple of graduate classes available on Poe. And I've also always really loved Gothic literature and everything horror and Halloween, right? So very much so like on brand for me. And as we Tony, I still remember the approach was kind of like, like humor in Poe and art in Poe and all of that. And the art in Poe really resonated with me. I ended up spending pretty much my entire graduate career really meshing visual art with literature and exploring the different ways that, they build on each other and how one kind of impacts the experience of the reader or the viewer, or in illustration's case, the reader viewer, right? And that ultimately became my master's thesis on Poe. So then Tony and I decided to make it a book.
Excellent. And Tony, we've talked many times on this program about Poe. These short stories, very visual, very illustrative, to say the least. How quickly do illustrators start to draw, their inspiration from Poe?
Well, it actually begins with the French. The French are the first to take on Poe, largely due to the influence of their poets, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and the great Edward Manet was the first, one of the first illustrators to deal with the Raven. And the Raven was a very popular subject in the 19th century.
Yes, we have a couple images that Manet painted. Of course, Manet was sort of the grandfather of the French Impressionists. Jess knows all about art history, so she can fill us in on the French Impressionist movement. But Manet, this is a big deal if Manet is drawing his inspiration or drawing images of your poem. Big deal for this nobody poet from America, right?
Well, we're talking at least 30 years after his death.
Right.
So, Poe was always interested in having his work illustrated, but nothing really came of it until finally the French discovered him, and largely through the translations of Baudelaire.
So that's where Manet. Well, he wouldn't have read it in the English. He would have read it.
He would have read it. He would have read it in the French, but he also would have been familiar with the talk, which was a big part of the parlor circuit in the 1860s and 1870s. Manet's work comes out in 1875.
Why the Raven? I mean, there's obvious reasons, but why that one?
Well, Jess, do you want to handle that one?
Why do you think it's the Raven, Jess?
Well, the Raven, I think a big part of it is sort of this idea of the flaneur, right? Where there's a lot of watching, there's kind of, you're there in the room, right? With the narrator. And that was something that really appealed to the French. And I think that really helped, again, when Baudelaire did a lot of these translations, along with Mallarmé, of course, it was something that actually finally resonated. And a lot of what we get into in the book, especially as we travel through the 5 different eras, right, is that there was something about Poe's work that appealed to each of these different eras of like writers and poets and painters and illustrators, right, that really carried it through that time period.
From the gaslit streets of Paris, we travel to the Satanic Mills of London town and Arthur Rackham. Who was Rackham, Jess, and which of Poe's works inspired him?
Illustrator from Britain. I think he published his largest collection of Poe's works in 1935. And what was just on the screen was the Cask of Amontillado. Now you're seeing the Pit and the Pendulum. The cover of our book actually is another Rackham from the Pit and the Pendulum. And this one's The Fall of the House of Usher. And he really, his works were, I was immediately drawn to his works because what they essentially represent is an amalgam of all the artists that come before him, right? You see him building on all of those eras, right? And he publishes this immense collection. I think it's something like 25 or 35 illustrations of Poe's works, right? It's included with Poe's works. They're illustrations. They're not just, standalone pieces of art.
Right.
He builds on like the pre-Raphaelite like romanticism of some of the work that is happening before the 1900. He builds on like the boundary pushing that the decadents and the symbolists do in the early 20th century. And then what he does is, as a modernist, he starts to question why those boundaries are there in the first place, right? He starts actually ascribing intent to his characters rather than, keeping them stylized and, removed from what they're doing.
I would add this. Don't forget the importance of color as you enter into the 20th century.
Yes.
As you enter into the 20th century, people like Rackham are starting to work with color. There was an image that we have, the cover of the book, which I joked about the Spanish Inquisition. Never joke about the Spanish Inquisition. Never expect the Spanish Inquisition either. That either.
But this is Arthur Rackham. Pit and the Pendulum, we're joking about it, but it is a story about a torture chamber, correct? So, I can't think of a better image that sort of is scary and inspired by a torture chamber than that image on the screen. If you look in the background there's monsters and devils and demons and all sorts of things plaguing this poor man. Another one of Poe's nameless characters, right? No name. This guy's just an unfortunate soul who got caught up in revolutionary or the games in Spain. Where would these images have appeared? You said that they sort of came along with Poe and his works. Magazines, collections. How does this work, Jess?
So largely illustrated volumes, right? So the Rackham one that we're seeing, they were illustrations that accompanied his short stories and just a publication of his work, right?
Okay.
Remember, at this point, Poe's been dead for almost 100 years by the time Rackham came along. So his were much more prolific and much more, accessible to the public. So they were being illustrated. But what you were saying about like the Spanish Inquisition with this one in particular, I think is so interesting because the cover of our book is when the narrator's in the pit, right? It's a great, one of our favorites, obviously. That's why we put it on the cover. But the black and white photo from earlier, that one is also from the same story. And what I think is so interesting about the idea that these illustrations were published next to the stories, right? Is that what that meant is that Arthur Rackham made a choice. The trial itself, that black and white photo, really just only depicts the trial, right? The part before they send the narrator to the pit. Right. But there's like one sentence about that in the actual, in the actual story. There's like one sentence that basically just says he's at a trial. But Arthur Rackham chooses that moment to illustrate and therefore bring to more light, you know what I mean, for the reader viewer's experience.
As we were prepping this program, neither of you mentioned my favorite Poe illustrator. So as host, I get to talk about my favorite, which is Gustave Doré, greatest printmaker of his day. He illustrated or made prints or engravings of Paradise Lost, Inferno, and a little book called the Bible. So no slouch, Doré. One of the last works he does is of Poe's The Raven, of course. Yeah. And these are the images, Doré's images of the Raven. And they're pretty, close to what you're reading in the poem. and what you're seeing. I mean, it definitely inspired by, and just the fact that you have the raven on the door and the narrator, that's how the poem feels. That picture that we had on the screen there, that's how the exhaustion that you feel reading the poem and his loss for the lovely Lenore.
And of course, the way in which Doré was influenced by